Welcome, everybody, to this session on the neural basis of decision-making and fostering decision superiority. My name's Jason Mattingly. I'm at the Queensland Brain Institute and the School of Psychology here in Brisbane at the University of Queensland. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. Thank you for being here. For those who went to the club night last night, I imagine there might be a few sore heads, but we really appreciate your presence. So we have 4 speakers, and I thought I'd start with just a little bit of background on the symposium. So understanding the brain processes that govern decision-making is central to advancing neuroscience. Decisions from perceptual judgments to complex moral choices emerge from dynamic interactions across distributed neural systems, including prefrontal, parietal, and subcortical regions. And so by leveraging cutting-edge imaging techniques, we can delineate the temporal and spatial architecture of these processes, and that helps us shed light on how the brain integrates information under uncertainty, how we evaluate value, and how the brain selects actions. So this symposium is going to bring together leading researchers in the field to present recent findings that illuminate the neural computations that underlie decision-making. So 4 speakers, and we're going to follow the order that's in the app, and then we'll have a panel discussion at the end, so hopefully there'll be a few minutes for questions. Remember to log any questions you have on your app, but also if you have questions from the audience, there's a microphone in the middle here that you can use. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Dragan Rangelov. So Dragan is in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Swinburne University in Melbourne, in Australia. And Dragan is interested in the neural and cognitive mechanisms of risky choices and in how choices are influenced by other cognitive processes, particularly attention and metacognition. And he's going to present behavioural and brain imaging results from recent work that focuses on the role of cognitive noise in shaping the temporal dynamics of risky choices in humans. So, Dragan.
Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I just would like to thank you, the organizers. This is my first time at OHBM, and it was super interesting so far, so thank you. So today the plan is to present findings of a recent study we conducted that sort of aimed to characterize temporal dynamics and neural mechanisms underlying risky choices. Before I start, just the regular non-disclosures. So broadly speaking, many decisions in everyday life are subject to uncertainty and risk. So considering to take out maybe flood insurance, which is popular in Queensland, would require you to sort of combine the probability of flood, which in Queensland is high, and the monthly premiums in order to estimate whether it's worth your money. Decades of research have shown that such decisions under risk and uncertainty are typically subject to very stereotypical biases. One of such biases is so-called risk aversion, which is essentially the willingness to forgo larger returns in order to maintain some sense of certainty. Another bias, which was perhaps less investigated, is loss aversion, which is a greater sensitivity to losses than to comparable gains. And these biases, as well as many others, have motivated researchers in the field to speculate that humans are essentially behaving irrationally. They are not really trying to optimize their gains and minimize their losses. A more recent theory kind of provides a more optimistic worldview on humans' ability to make choices, and that theory posits that essentially humans are actually making good choices, but they are making or basing these choices on noisy cognitive and neural representations of risk and payoffs. And this is, at least to me, attractive because it provides a more optimistic worldview of how humans make choices. And this theory, known as cognitive imprecision theory, essentially uses principles of Bayesian inference to model those choices. Interestingly, these risk and loss aversion biases emerge naturally if you account for the noise present in cognitive representations of risks and payoffs. So what we went out to investigate in this study was a question whether the noise present in these representations produces causal effects of these choice biases. And specifically, we were focusing on risk aversion and loss aversion. And we were also interested in characterizing when in time these biases arise, because previous research was predominantly, has used fMRI, which is notoriously not necessarily spatially sensitive. So to that purpose, we used a better measure of neural activity. Well, the one that has greater temporal sensitivity. So in this study, we recorded EEG as participants performed the task. And in every trial, we presented this particular array of 12 striped, differently oriented gratings. And regardless of the trial type, participants always had to compute the average orientation of these gratings. It's a bit of a tricky task, but you can train participants to do it. So in this particular display, the average orientation would be vertical. Before behavioral testing, we trained our participants to associate particular orientations with particular payoffs, such that for some participants, vertical average orientations would carry 10 plus points, and horizontal orientations would carry negative 10 points. So we trained them, and they knew how many points each average orientation was carrying. In the value task, we told them, okay, so this display that you have just seen and the average orientation that you have computed is our offer to you. This is how much points you stand to gain or lose, and do you want to accept it or reject it? If participants rejected, nothing would happen. They would just go on to another trial. If they accepted the offer, however, they were awarded the number of points proportional to the average orientation. Now, it is risky to accept, because presumably the estimate of the orientation, of the average orientation, is never going to be exactly the same as the true average orientation. So participants need to sort of consider about what they think the average is, as well as how certain or uncertain they are about that estimate. In a different task, we just asked them to report by dialing up this response dial to report what they thought the average orientation was. And here we were interested in participants' perception by analyzing the difference between their actual responses and the correct response, or the magnitude of their errors. So the main manipulation here was the noise manipulation. We are, you will remember, quite interested in the role of noise in these decisions. And we manipulated sensory noise between low noise and high noise in such a way that in low noise condition, these orientations were all similar to each other, whereby in the high noise condition, individual orientations varied greatly. In fact, we were sampling these orientations randomly from distributions that were defined by different variance parameters. Good. So what I'm plotting here are grand average behavioral data from this perceptual task, where participants just had to report their estimate of the average orientation. On the x-axis, I'm plotting the error magnitude, and on the y, I'm plotting the simply distribution of trials across all participants. And importantly, here we have expressed the error magnitude in such a way that positive errors denote participants' errors that go toward the orientation that signals higher gain, whereby negative orientations, negative errors signal participants' responses towards orientations that signal loss. So we can kind of estimate participants' biases, if you wish. By using particular computational model, we can estimate the probabilities of guessing, how precise participants are, and such perceptual biases. And what we found in the behavioral task was that participants were more likely to guess in high noise condition, they were less precise in high noise condition, and interestingly, they were more likely to make a mistake towards the orientations that carry the gain. This was an incidental finding, which I kind of call optimism bias, which we are looking into further. What I'm plotting here are behavioral results from the value task. So what we see here on the x-axis are binned values of the displays across all possible values as a function of proportion of risky choices. And what we see here is that participants are more likely to accept that offer the larger the true value is. So they are able to do the task. You can characterize the shape of this function, again, by fitting it to a particular mathematical model characterized by 3 parameters. And these 3 parameters are value sensitivity, or the overall steepness of the curve, which here was characterized with lower, trials with high noise were characterized by lower value sensitivity. What we also found was another parameter that is proportionate to risk aversion. We found that participants were more risk averse in higher noise condition. And this is a replication from previous findings. Christian will probably talk more about that. This is what we wanted to show, and actually we have shown in our particular paradigm. Again, less investigated in the literature, we also found that participants were less loss averse in high noise conditions. So these two biases seem to be differentially affected by the noise. Now, in terms of EEG analysis, I'm going to plot analysis during 1 second over which that visual display was presented on the screen. And to kick things off, here I'm plotting the time course of ERPs across the whole scalp, time locked to the onset of the visual display. And I hope you will all appreciate that there's this sort of positivity bump situated at central and parietal brain regions or scalp regions, which in the literature actually even has been given a name. It's called centroparietal positivity, or CPP. And it has been well documented that this particular ERP component plays a significant role in temporal dynamics of decision making. So what we can analyze next is whether the amplitude of that CPP was sensitive to the parameters of our experimental design, to our noise manipulation and our value manipulation. And here I'm plotting these values are thresholded for multiple comparisons. Anything colored here is statistically significant. And what we are observing is this period in the last 100 milliseconds where the magnitude of the payoff was modulating CPP statistically significant. And in addition, we observed these interesting two-way interactions between noise and magnitude, and as well sign, gains or losses, and magnitude. So in other words, CPP seems to be sensitive to manipulations of both noise, which we expected, and interestingly, magnitude of the payoff. Here I'm plotting the average CPP binned across true values in that period of 100 milliseconds, and this is essentially what we are seeing. High magnitudes were associated with a higher negativity, and this negativity was more prominent in the domain of gains versus losses. And finally, the whole profile of this value sensitivity was somewhat steeper or sharper, if you wish, for low noise condition than in high noise condition. Now, we observe that participants are behaviorally sensitive to values. We observe that CPP is also sensitive to value. But can we predict behavioral risky choices from CPP? What I'm showing here is a large regression in which we used CPP amplitude to predict whether people are going to accept or reject that offer. And we do not find any statistically significant effect here. In other words, CPP is not predictive of these choices. In the second EEG analysis, what we characterized was the pattern across the whole scalp in order to characterize so-called feature-specific responses. Without going into much details, ultimately we derived some sort of representation of neural activity that potentially ends up resembling this sort of bell-shaped curve with a prominent peak. And that particular peak possibly denotes what the brain, if you will, thinks the average orientation of the presented display is. So we can characterize that peak, and if we know that, we can also transform or express that as the value, because there was one-to-one mapping between orientations and values. In other words, we can decode neural representation of value, and we can also decode how correct, how accurate that representation was by computing the difference between, if you will, what the brain thinks the value was and the true value of the display. In other words, we can decode the error. So what I'm plotting here is the time course of neural representations of the value, and we observe here, 0 here means the true value of the display, so I normalized all trials such that the true value of display was at 0. And what we see here in this relatively kind of very bright yellow stripe is that, yes, we are able to decode neural representation of value robustly, starting from roughly 100 milliseconds after the display onset. What I'm showing here are the analysis of whether the precision of the neural representation of value, that decoding error, is impacted by experimental modulations such as noise or value or payoff. And unlike CPP, we observe these interesting interactions between noise sign, which is losses or gains, and the magnitude of the payoff around half a second at between 500 milliseconds and 600 milliseconds. So this neural representation of value seems to arise relatively early, comparably early, and it is sensitive to the manipulation of noise. What I'm showing here essentially is the profile of the coded values as a function of true values, and here we essentially see something that quite closely mimics the behavioral choice curves, such that the overall profile in the low noise condition is sharper than the profile of the coded neural values in the high noise condition. In other words, we are able to demonstrate that neural representations of value kind of follow closely the true representations of value. But are they predictive of risky choices? In the final analysis, I tried to predict people's risky choices using the representations of neural value. And unlike the analogous analyses for the CPP, here we do observe statistically significant effect. Namely, neural representations of value are predictive of people's risky choices. So, what have we learned? So, in this particular study, what we were able to demonstrate was a qualitative and quantitative correspondence between behavioral and neural value functions. What does that mean? So we have shown that sensory noise increases behavioral risk aversion, decreases behavioral loss aversion, and we showed two neural correlates that are both sensitive to value. However, only the coded neural values and the associated precision in decoding those values predict risky choices, which is consistent with the theory, cognitive imprecision theory. And what we observe is that neural value representations are less precise for large gains as the noise increases, which technically accounts quantitatively for choices under uncertainty. With that, I would like to thank you and other panel members. Thank you for accepting to speak today. And yes, so we can continue the discussion later on.